My guest at this time is Gordon Chang. He's an East Asia policy expert and the author of The Coming Collapse of China. We want to get his thoughts as China responds to the outbreak of the coronavirus and as the United States indicts 4 Chinese military figures in connection with the 2017 Equifax data breach that compromised the private information of more than 145 million Americans. And Gordon, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, as usual, the Chinese giving us plenty to talk about here. First of all, China is giving statistics on the number of cases and number of deaths related to the coronavirus. But when we see massive cities on a total lockdown and videos of sprayers rolling through the streets, people are wondering what the real story is. So what are you hearing about the scope and severity of this?
Yeah, the severity is much greater than China is officially reporting. They're reporting just a little over 1,000 deaths, but there are these stories that Wuhan, the epicenter of the virus, is cremating hundreds of bodies a day. That doesn't fit very easily with a death toll of 1,000. A number of cases, although I think are probably more than the 43,000 or so that China is now maintaining has occurred. So there is an epidemic much more serious than Beijing is willing to admit.
Why aren't they willing to admit it? Why not just say, we're working on this, we might need a little bit of help? What's the point of the secrecy?
I think there are a couple of things. First of all, Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, is much more interested in controlling the narrative than he is in ending the epidemic. Because, for instance, this is an issue now of the maintenance of Communist Party rule. The Communist Party says it's infallible, but but as Chinese people look around and see what's occurring, obviously it isn't. So I think they're trying to minimize the death toll and the count on the number of infections to try to fit that into the party's storyline that it should remain in power.
Gordon, we want to separate fact from fiction here, and one of the things we keep seeing on social media and some other places as well is the suggestion that something got out of a biowarfare lab that existed in Wuhan City and still does, I guess. Is that verified in any way, or is that simply a conspiracy theory at this point?
Well, it's a theory. I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy theory. There's a lot that we do not know about the coronavirus. So, for instance, when the outbreak was first reported, people were saying that this could be traced to a wet market in Wuhan. That's where they sell live animals. But The Lancet, the British medical journal, in late January said that most of the initial cases had nothing to do with the wet market. And so that keeps alive this notion that perhaps there was an accidental release of the coronavirus from the P4 lab. That's the highest level of biosecurity. Therefore, right now, any possibility the possibilities are still open.
You mentioned that Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is more interested in controlling the narrative than actually stopping the outbreak. But at least from what we're seeing, we've got some major cities essentially grinding to a halt here while this is dealt with. So as long as that's going on, what's the impact on the Chinese economy?
Well, the Chinese economy now, I think, is contracting. Oil demand is down 20% year on year. We know that a lot of the factories remain closed after the Lunar New Year holiday. The Canton Fair, which is the export exposition in April, a main event for China's factories, that has been canceled. A lot of events in China that were scheduled to be held are now not going to be. So I think that we can say that the Chinese economy is in the red, and that has a big issue for the Communist Party, which has said that it's responsible for prosperity. Well, if they're responsible for prosperity, they're responsible for this downturn as well, and that's why I think that you're going to see and continue to see state economists say that the economy will grow no less than 5% this quarter. That's just imaginary.
So China is in need in terms of dealing with the coronavirus. It's also in a weakened position economically based on what you just told us. So what's the proper posture of President Trump and the United States here in dealing with China economically and in terms of the virus itself?
We need to maintain the policies and practices that are now in place, including the quarantine for people coming from Wuhan. The thing that's important right now is that the U.S. has had about a 10, 11, 12 cases for more than a week. That shows that this is stable and that the Centers for Disease Control and Protection have been doing a good job. Obviously, they're going to have to continue to monitor this because there probably will be more cases in the U.S. So I think the Trump administration is doing the right thing at this particular time. But there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I'm sure the administration will continue to do that.
Let's move to the Equifax hack now. As I mentioned, the Justice Department indicting 4 different Chinese military figures for the attack that happened in July of 2017. We already knew that China hacked the Office of Personnel Management and compromised the data of millions of federal employees and even applicants for federal jobs back in the Obama administration. Is there anything that surprises you about China now being linked to the Equifax hack?
No, because China has, for a long period of time, tried to get personal information of Americans, and fits in line with that. The administration it's good to indict Chinese military officers, but in all probability, they'll never see the inside of a federal court. We have to take sterner measures to go after this because this poses an extremely vital threat to the U.S.
What is China doing with that information? How do they weaponize it?
Well, first of all, they can use this to power their artificial intelligence systems. AI runs on data, but also they can find Americans who are vulnerable to Chinese persuasion because they've got some problem in their background. So therefore, there are all sorts of things that can be done with this. And I think that essentially we have to view this as an attack on the U.S.
How are we doing in the cyber war, specifically with China right now? Is it close? Is one side winning? How would you characterize it?
Well, one thing we can say is that nothing that the U.S. has done to deter the Chinese from cyber hacking American networks has actually been effective. And so we've got to consider measures which are tougher. President Trump's tariffs were meant to stop intellectual property theft. The Equifax hack probably had intellectual property aspects to it as they learned how to run a large credit system. So we just need to, in one way or another, increase the costs on China so that the costs are greater than the benefits it receives from all of this hacking. And by the way, Greg, this hacking of Equifax, as the others, that was a violation of Xi Jinping's agreement made in September 2015 with President Obama not to hack the networks of the other country for commercial purposes. But we've got to understand that China does not adhere to its promises.
Given that point, what's your advice with the ongoing trade negotiations? Are they pointless because China won't abide by them anyway? Is it good to get them on the record? How would you advise there?
Yeah, I think that we need to end the trade negotiations because we can see that China does not abide by its promises. You know, the remedy for decades of failed agreements with China is not to sign up another one. The remedy is to increase the cost. So I think the tariff should go to levels which make it unlikely that Americans will buy Chinese goods.
Last question on a completely different topic here, Gordon. You know how the U.S. media works. They follow a story and then something else distracts them from that story for weeks or even months at a time. So we haven't heard a lot about the situation in Hong Kong for a while. What's the latest there? Are the protests still going on? Is there still a response from the police via the Chinese government? What's the latest?
Well, the protests are going on, but at a reduced level, as people are afraid to go out in public. But also we know that there are protests have changed focus somewhat because the government of Carrie Lam, the Hong Kong chief executive, the most senior political official there, has adopted policies that people in Hong Kong don't like about the quarantine and the coronavirus. People in Hong Kong don't want to see the traffic from China because they feel, and I'm sure that they're right, that tourists and others from China bring the virus into Hong Kong. So I think we can say that once the coronavirus epidemic ends, these protests on all fronts are going to increase probably dramatically.
A lot to keep track of, and you do an excellent job of bringing us up to speed. Mr. Chang, thank you very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Gordon Chang is an East Asia policy expert and author of The Coming Collapse of China. You can find him on Twitter @Gordon G. Chang. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.